So I don't think classical retellings are very good. At all. That's my controversial opinion, let's get into it. Okay, so I know, as someone who is literally studying classical retellings, primarily mainly looking at classical reception in literature, which isn't always necessarily a retelling, I really dislike basically all of the retellings out there. I have come to this conclusion over many years of giving them a go. Obviously, started off absolutely fine with Song of Achilles, but even before Song of Achilles, when I, back at university read like the Penelopiad and things like that, or the Penelopiad, I've heard it pronounced different ways, wasn't a fan of that either. So I don't think classical retellings are very good. In literature, I think they've been done well in film more often than not, and even then that's contentious, but that is my controversial hot take, and I'm going to explore it totally. So first of all, I want to kind of break down this idea of classical retellings in general, because I'm not sure they do the thing that I think they are arguing that they do. And if they are doing the thing that they're doing, which I doubt they are, I don't think they're doing a very good job of it. Let me explain. I think we've had this plethora of many retellings over the past few years because they're trying to emulate the whole Me Too movement, women telling their stories. And the vast majority of classical retellings over the past 8 years have been written by women and about female characters with the idea of quote unquote reclaiming their voices. But I genuinely have never enjoyed most of these books. And I know a lot of people would argue that classical reception is important because it, makes classics more accessible to the masses, which is an argument. However, I'm not sure it's an effective one in practicality, and I'm not sure in theory and practice it actually performs as such. I haven't seen a translation in interest in the classical world and ancient history due to publications such as classical retellings at all. I can't really see a trend. I haven't seen the trend in academia. I haven't suddenly seen the trend in content and stuff for history, interests and things like that. I don't think a lot of people are turning to the ancient texts after reading these classical reception texts. I think it's more of a mass market kind of angle that intrigues people, but I don't think they do the original stories much justice or add anything more to the original stories that I got from the original stories. Maybe I'm coming at this from a more privileged position in that I read a lot of the stories that they're talking about in the original text. I'm using the original text slightly because obviously there's no such thing as an original myth, but in the old ancient texts I read these stories before reading classical retellings of them, and I am hyper aware that any criticism of a contemporary story results in a lot of people screaming elitism to the idea of this kind of gatekeeping of it. I know, I don't think there is a gatekeeping of it. I don't think they add much more to what is happening in the original text, even when they are amplifying the women's voices. So you have explorations of Penelope that explore her. Medusa obviously never speaks, but she has lots of books about her. The same goes with Persephone and Hades stories. That's very popular, particularly in the YA genre. But then we have loads of things like Trojan women, etc. Everyone's been covered to the point that now they're going into new realms of mythology. And I can't help but feel, due to the mass production of these texts, that the sincerity behind the writing of them and really recapturing these women is more for personal gain than it is actually for the wonders and amplification of women in the ancient world. There are very few texts that I feel have done a really great job at recapturing women's voices and using classical reception to do that. So I've mentioned Camilla Shamsi's Home Fire. I think that's a fantastic employment of Greek texts here, of the ancient plays, in looking at a dynamic in modern day world. Also, I'm loving the book After Sappho, which again is using classical reception of Sappho's lyric poetry to explore historical women, particularly lesbians in history. And again, I think that's a really fantastic employment of classical texts to analyse and evaluate another story in tense, whether that's a historical story or partly autobiographical or a new fictional story. Also, what I love about Song of Achilles is not obviously reclaiming women's voices at all, but it's exploring an area of the text that was kind of undercovered, but in a genuinely, what I feel when I read the text was a really sincere way of exploring a new avenue of how this story can be explored. And it's not, hinging on relaying the story beat for beat, which I feel like a lot of these retellings do. A lot of these retellings tell the story beat for beat, but just add a woman there and change the narrator to a woman and maybe amplify things. But maybe because I'm biased, because I am a woman, there are things that I wasn't unaware of when I was reading the original text. Obviously, they weren't brought to the forefront, but I don't feel like the impact is really there. And I feel like the mass commodification and commercialization of women's stories has actually diluted the significance of a lot of the tales that they're trying to tell, to the point that I don't think these are actually doing the women justice, the mythological women justice. I find them a little bit too beat for beat reliant on the heavy lifting of ancient texts or the stories that they know of the ancient texts. What I find fascinating when I'm reading classical reception texts is that a lot of women or a lot of the authors haven't read some of the texts that they're referring to, or haven't read from an original source in some kind, or combined a load of sources. They know of the story. And I know this because, one author, who's Jessie Burton, wrote a Medusa, who actually I really, I thought was a decent story. Obviously, she changed the tale of Medusa wildly, but she in interviews says that she doesn't know much about Medusa other than the Versace sign and the general gist of it. And in doing the general gist of it, obviously what most of our understandings of ancient texts have come through reiterations of other people's versions of ancient texts, and then you end up reiterating things that weren't there in any of the ancient sources. So a prime example of this, which I have an issue with the Penelope ad, is Margaret Atwood's kind of pitching women against women. There's obviously a very dynamic between Penelope being better than Helen of Troy, who she refers to as a slut, as a whore, and she's kind of presented as such. So we have this kind of woman-on-woman dynamic here, which is very much pitting two women against one another, one being more superior, the other one being labelled as slut, which when people read a lot of old translations of the text, they think that's what Helen of Troy was presented as, but that's purely down to a translation of Helen of Troy by men later in life. It's not really in the ancient text of her being presented that way. She is called dog-faced, but what is meant by dog-face in the ancient text, we don't really know. But a lot of translators chose to reiterate the term like dog-face into slut and whore, and then laced onto Helen of Troy from the ancient text a load of misogyny of the Western world, which is then being reiterated through classical reception and then repeated to the detriment of Helen of Troy. So really what I find difficult with classical reception and classical retellings is that they haven't really played a lot with the wealth of material out there about the characters that they're writing about. They take a translation of such or know a story from a film. You can tell a lot of the texts have come from like even other media representations of that story. Sometimes I can see in a text where they've got that from Troy, the film, and not actually from the Iliad, or not even from ancient history. The amount of people who reiterate placing coins on people's eyes because they probably saw it in Troy, when that never happened in that period at all with the ancient Greeks. That's a very Viking thing. You placed it under the tongue, but they probably reiterated that from other classical reception. It's become so diluted. And this isn't me saying that the ancient texts are superior, but when it comes to actually analysing what there is worth and the value in these ancient texts, taking it from diluted sources over and over and over again makes it feel a little bit meh when I'm reading the text. And I feel it when I'm reading these texts. They haven't got like literary wealth to them. There's no richness in them. There's no real exploration of what these ancient texts meant. They've kind of taken the story and then regurgitated it beat for beat. But I know the story already, and it doesn't make it more feminist coming from a woman's voice as it did from a man's. I don't feel any of the visceral stuff because I feel like a lot of people have kind of oversimplified, or not even oversimplified, even the trauma that a lot of these women went through are disconnected from the authors themselves. Thank God, a lot of the authors have not gone through the things that these women have gone through, particularly enslaved women or war. But then that is a kind of weird dilution of what actually happened in these texts, and what the fierceness of the ancient world that I feel when I'm reading the ancient texts is kind of meh when I read these women. I don't feel the same kind of soul. I don't feel like the authors really took the time to dissect the history and culture and wealth beneath these characters to really extrapolate them. I feel like it's just kind of, this woman got raped and therefore I'm going to tell about her trauma, and that's kind of it. But then the stories kind of blur into one another because, yeah, there's a lot of women in ancient texts that were raped, and then their stories can kind of almost be swapped over with one another. People forget their names. And I know the intention, the argued intention, is to keep these women's names at the forefront of our minds, but is there any richness in perpetuating these stories of them as just the rape victim? And it's a really fascinating, I love Charlotte Higgins's Greek myths retelling, which is, I think, really cleverly done. And she is kind of leading into the compendium tradition of, just relaying the stories as the resources have given her. She selected what she's included and what she hasn't she's excluded, and brought together this text. And what she does with one of the myths in particular, which is the myth of Philomela, who's obviously, she is raped and her tongue is cut out. So she tells her story via a tapestry that she sends to her sister, who then finds out about the rape by her sister's Procne's husband. But in Charlotte Higgins's work, she doesn't detail the rape story at all. Her Philomela doesn't tell of her rape in her tapestry. She tells of her tongue being severed from her mouth. And what I love about that image is that Charlotte Higgins, in just a small sentence, demonstrates that if these ancient women were given the chance to tell their story, would they actually choose to tell it? And in her case, Philomela does not choose to tell it. She chooses to tell a different version of her story. Not untrue, because obviously her tongue is cut out, but she doesn't keep her rape in the story. That is not the story she chooses to document. And I think that's where I am exhausted and a bit bored by a lot of classical retellings, because they do just tell the story as I already know it, beat for beat, by told by a man, and changing the narrator's gender doesn't add any depth to it. Even giving the details of what happened doesn't really add any depth to it. And I feel like the commercialization of this retelling of women's stories has really weakened what significance they actually hold, which is why I don't like them. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to be doing these little videos, like mini rants about things like this, throughout December. So if you're interested, please subscribe and like the video. Tell me that you like it. I'm playing with the content varied on this channel because people gave me feedback. But thanks to people's feedback, people miss my bookish talks, and people miss me being more like about academia but not generally detailed about history. So I'm going to play with the format a bit throughout December. So please, all the feedback is welcome. And thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon for another video. And remember, books save lives, so keep reading.